Here's my last video for this little shelving project, and yes, I've done quite a bit since the previous, where I ended the previous video, but it was mostly time to start shading and rendering, and that's a whole fun subject in itself, as well as the just a little bit too much detail about as far as cylinders and ellipses. So we'll be getting into that with other projects that aren't so small dimensionally, so be able to understand better. But just a couple things on shading. I definitely wanted to make sure that I was following the general pattern of this inside shape and the wall, and that there was some shadows being cast on the wall, including a little bit of the bars. This top rectangle is, well, I would say this one is probably the lightest overall. I'm squinting. I'm just kind of trying to find out what the sequence should be, and I kind of made this one the lightest, this a little bit darker, but this was the lightest, and then this one is a little bit darker, and darker still, and darker still. So I have this progression, and obviously it's not exactly in line with the photograph, but I do have a progression where I'm wanting to think of this shape as the lightest overall, and then I'm getting progressively darker in these shapes as I go down. Down here, I borrowed the reference material from this one in two-point perspective, angled perspective, and to add these little footy things, and to add a little bit, and a little indication of where the floor meets the wall edge. And there's kind of a fun thing going on here. And so as far as the general overall shading, that's the main thing to me, is just to make sure I figure out what the sequence, the pattern, once again, is going to kind of be. And that's a fun big subject, and we'll talk more about that too. But it's also a fun opportunity to use your kneaded eraser as really kind of a painting tool, and or sort of a blender. That shape was getting too dark, and I can really just come in and kind of touch up, and if I want to shift the value just a little tiny bit, I can do it with this by just coming in and kind of touching that. It's an absorber and not an abrasive. Erasing. Once you've used it like that, you are absorbing, and you're pulling up the graphite into the kneaded eraser. So then I will mix that back in with all the old graphite that's in there, and get sort of a fresh tip. So I'll do this, and I'll go back and forth between lifting out a little bit, blending a little bit with my finger, leaning back and just kind of getting an overall sense of, does it does it overall make sense? And I think it's doing fine. Once again, not exactly like the reference. A couple other things. Oh, I was down here and I wanted to just sort of point out the transition between, shading is really, for me, just all about getting good at understanding values. Well, that's not what it's all about. There's several things, but making it really clear where it's dark, where it's shifting from a lighter value to a darker value. And it was kind of fun playing with this one because I'm shifting with a cast shadow being darker down here. And then as we get further away from that cast shadow, that it shifts from being darker to lighter to darker. And trying to make that a smooth transition is a fun little challenge. And let's see. Aside from just really having an overall sense of where it's going to be getting darker and where it's going to be lighter, it's very important to make sure, sort of like down here, that you indicate and it's clear which plane, anytime there's an edge that has different, indicates different planes, like this edge is a combination of the back wall and the front edge of this shelf, to make it really clear that which is lighter and which is darker. And this image has several fun lighting challenges going on. But in general, what I want to make sure I'm doing is on the underside of this top shelf, I want to make sure that it's the shelf that's actually the darkest. And then it gets a little bit lighter. The shading is a little bit lighter. And that's because light is coming sort of from a couple different directions, really, but from up. So this is definitely the bottom plane and not getting any light. And as that shifts, then the top plane will be getting more light. And then I'm making sure that what's clearly the darkest is the line of the shadow. So let me see if I can even make that even more clear. This one is getting a little bit lost in translation. Another really important thing, there's so many important things, but is indicating this little edge, this little highlight. It's almost like there's this slightly white line going across, and once again, fun big subject, but I try to make sure that those highlights are not getting lost. First of all, that's the most important thing. And that they're sort of making overall sense. I'm really going putting quite a bit of graphite on here, so it's going to get shiny. And if I was really going to focus on shading and rendering. I would have stopped with my 4B probably a little while ago and then shifted over to that that other Staedtler pencil, which is the black. Forgetting what it's called right now. Black Graphic or something like that. 8B. So let me see. I wanted to make sure that that was darker than that. That's darker than that. So there's all these subtle relationships going on where, you know, this is the lightest overall. This is a little bit darker. This is a little bit darker. This is a little bit darker. And everything in here has to, I try to make sure it makes sense with that. And that the cast shadows being cast by the pipe, for example, are going along with that same idea. And they're also a little bit darker right underneath where the light is getting cut out. So, like I said, a lot of fun stuff, and hopefully that gets you at least going on that. And like I say, I will have subsequent projects that focus more on ellipses and shading, because there is a lot of fun shading in perspective and shading as well. But I think I'll leave it there for now, and I'll keep fussing and not finishing for, oh, a good 2 or 3 years. No, who knows, maybe I will. Okay.